Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're coming to you from Alliance Magazine in London, and we're being joined by our partners and panelists in the Arab region, as well as you, our friends and colleagues from all around the world. I'm Farouky, the digital editor at Alliance and the moderator of today's webinar, which is part of Alliance at 25, a celebration of Alliance's 25 years at the heart of global philanthropy. Our event today is the first in a series of discussions that will explore what the future of philanthropy holds in different regions of the world. Today we'll be focusing in on the who, what, where, and how of Arab philanthropy with panelists NOURA SELIM, MOUKTHAR KOCACHE, and RASHA AL-TURKI. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at Cambridge Judge Business School for sponsoring this event, and the Arab Foundations Forum for partnering with us on its production. The Center for Strategic Philanthropy has recently released a report showing the need to address the North-South power imbalance in global philanthropy, and everyone here today will receive a copy of this report after the event is over. Just a few more notes for everyone attending today before we start our main event. For our audience, you can go ahead and say hello in our chat on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be keeping an eye on this throughout the webinar, and if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, make sure to go ahead and ask them here. Also on the panel on the right-hand side, you can find under the Offers tab the opportunity to get a free print copy of our latest issue on global health philanthropy with any donation over £5 to Alliance Magazine. As a registered charity, Alliance generates much of our income, but we still rely on generous support to keep bringing you trusted, independent, and expert insight. And finally, Alliance is currently running a poll asking readers to vote on their favorite special feature from a shortlist drawn from our almost 100 issues published over the past 25 years. The winner of our poll will be revisited in a special column later on this year in our anniversary coverage. And for anyone who's interested in participating, we'll share the link in our webinar chat. And now I'd like to turn things over to our partner, Arab Foundations Forum CEO NAILA Farouky, who will share some thoughts on what she thinks the coming decades of Arab philanthropy may hold.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Elika. And a big thanks to Alliance Magazine for inviting the Arab Foundations Forum to partner on this event, and to the Cambridge Center for Strategic Philanthropy for hosting us. It's a real pleasure to join you all today and to join our wonderful panel of expert speakers who will each share with you a unique experience and perspective on the Arab region's philanthropic landscape, given the myriad ways in which it manifests across this vast region. I think we often mistakenly think that we can lump entire regions into one homogeneous experience, and we know that this is far from the truth. From our vantage point as a network of Arab philanthropic actors with members in at least 11 countries across the region, we definitely know that although we certainly face similar challenges, whether they come in the form of government restrictions or banking restrictions, etc., the ways in which we practice philanthropy do vary from place to place and for different reasons. At the AFF, we often think about the trajectory that the sector is heading in, because this very much impacts the way that we serve our members and the way that we serve our network. And in our region, we've certainly had a lot to think about. In the past 10 years alone, the region has faced many socio-political, economic events that have affected the way that our philanthropic sector functions. And then in 2020, the global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic took things to a whole new level. So while we may be navigating and may have been navigating the consequences of a post-revolution, post-Arab Spring reality, we're now faced with also designing the future of our sector in a post-COVID reality. So making that task much more difficult. And the role of our foundations and other nonprofit sector players cannot be understated. But given many of the challenges that we continue to face with cross-border giving, banking regulations that make it increasingly difficult to give effectively, and other restrictions that choke our sector, the question of how we collaborate and the importance of that collaboration and partnership is what I believe will take center stage, especially in this remote world that we're finding ourselves in. So in our sector, I think we pay a lot of lip service to the benefits of partnership and the benefits of cooperation. But our societies, many of which depend on the efficacy of the third sector in many ways, will not survive without a concerted effort on our part to build partnerships that are based on this shared experience, based on a transparency of data, shared knowledge, and in that true spirit of kind of building stronger societies together. So for our part, as the AFF, we've been hit hard by many of the challenges that face the region, and we've had struggles during COVID for sure, just like everyone else. But 1 year into what is now a redefined normal for all of us, we've designed a plan that we hope will allow us to continue to serve our network. One of the ways that we hope to do that is by growing our reach and our footprint. So we're hoping to expand the eligibility criteria for membership in our network so that we can invite a more diverse representation of our sector. Beyond that, we've just launched a very comprehensive data project with Dahlberg Consultants that spans the entire region and includes data on COVID response by Arab philanthropic actors. So sharing that data and making it accessible will be a critical priority for us, and we believe ultimately a real asset to the sector. And then finally, we're grateful for and will continue to leverage these partnerships with organizations like Alliance Magazine and the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, among many others, that allow us to convene with our peers to share our thoughts, our successes, our failures, and that give us this opportunity to exchange the ideas that can support our collective success. Because God knows we all need it. So thank you so much for joining us. And I will pass it over to you, Elika, so that we can welcome our panelists for what I know is going to be a wonderfully engaging session. And we'll talk some more when we're done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, NAILA. I'm really looking forward to exploring some of these ideas today with our expert panelists, which I'm now delighted to introduce you to our panel. Our panelists today include NOURA SELIM, the Executive Director of the Sawiris Foundation for Social Development in Egypt, MOUKTHAR KOCACHE, the founder of the Rawa Fund in Palestine, and RASHA AL-TURKI, the CEO of the Alnahda Society for Women in Saudi Arabia. And we're very excited to have all of you with us today. So first, I'm going to hand the floor over to NOURA for a few opening remarks. As the executive director of a family foundation based in Egypt, it would be great to hear you share your reflections on what you see as the trajectory of Arab philanthropy.
Thank you very much, Elika, and thank you so much to you and to Alliance Magazine for having me with you. So as I reflect on the trajectory of philanthropy in Egypt, and I think a lot of this also applies to the Arab world broadly, I would say there are 4 things that have happened over the past decade. One is more institutionalization of philanthropy. And by that, I mean, I think the Arab world in giving has generally been a region where there's tremendous giving, perhaps driven a lot by religious reasons, other reasons. Charity has always been a part of our culture, but moving to the institutionalization of that, whereby there are a lot of corporate foundations that you see today, a lot of family foundations. Sawiris Foundation is an example of that. Having started 20 years ago, where there were very few family foundations, but now where you see a lot of family foundations in Egypt and in the region, and a lot of NGOs. So in Egypt today, there are around 55,000 active NGOs that are registered within the Ministry of Social Solidarity. So I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is an increased importance and recognition of that importance of philanthropy. So today in Egypt as well, you see some of the largest hospitals, nonprofit hospitals, that are serving the most underprivileged being NGOs, whether this is the case for cancer, for children's cancer, for heart disease, for many other areas. You're seeing the same in education, you're seeing the same in poverty reductions, you're seeing very significant NGO players. And I would say the third is professionalization of philanthropy. And I know this is sort of a big word when you talk about professionalization, but again, with the move from charity to institutionalization, we're seeing philanthropy now talking a lot about, proper governance, very professional fundraising, professional mechanisms of funding in general, knowledge and knowledge exchange, a lot of webinars, a lot of conferences, a lot of talk about things that were not on the table before. Evidence-based programming, basically the recognition that this is not about just doing good and feeling that you donated, but that philanthropy is a science and that there's a professional way by which philanthropic organizations should be run, should be managed, should fund. And I would say the fourth is collaboration. So we're definitely seeing significant collaboration between government and the philanthropic sector, between private sector and the philanthropic sector, basically sort of the golden triangle that everyone always talks about, right? Private sector coming together with government, coming together with NGOs to address very significant and big issues. We've seen that in COVID, where I think philanthropy in Egypt, and I'm sure in across the Arab world, has been a significant player in the humanitarian response, as well as in supporting the healthcare system. And so I perhaps will end with, what is missing? So all this has been great, but then clearly there are a number of things that are also important that are missing. And I think that, I want to take from what NAILA said about transparency. So as the sector is becoming more professional, the sector is becoming more transparent. But I think there's still sort of a lot more room for improvement when it comes to transparency of the philanthropic sector, particularly around financials, definitely around impact. I think as a sector, we still like to talk about, nice stories and good stories and showing pictures of children that we serve. But when you really, focus around rigorous impact, I think this investing in its measurement, investing in its reporting, being okay to report about things that have not worked, there's plenty of room for improvement. The second, I would say, is more rigor in general. And so, and I would like to take from a book I finished that I would definitely highly recommend, More Than Good Intentions by Dean Carlin. And it talks about that a lot of the philanthropic sector is driven by good intentions. And, he basically says, just because you have a hammer, not everything is a nail. And I think that holds very true, because in the Arab world at large and in the global philanthropic sector, there tends to be a lot of things that are based on good intentions. Let's do this because it feels good to do this kind of program. But I would say that I would hope that in Egypt and in the Arab world, we really focus on, evidence-based programming, on, even if we're going to try and innovate and do something, then at least we test it. We do it in a pilot phase, and then we can scale it up because it works. And we use less of our intentions and much more so of the science that exists. And I think we're seeing globally, if we look at the winners, the co-founders of JPAL that won the recent Nobel Prize, all about their work on randomized controlled trials that have to do with poverty. So I would hope that as a region, we start adapting more of that. And then I would just close with, definitely a more conducive environment. And in Egypt, I think one positive sign is that, the new NGO law that just got passed recently a year ago was definitely a great improvement over the one that was, right prior, particularly around, foreign funding, the speed by which the process works. But I think there's still, again, more room for improvement in the environment for NGOs operating in the Arab world, particularly around regulations. And I don't have an issue with the regulations per se. It's more in streamlining and having the process be efficient. So if the process were to exist for reasons that I think I can understand, then it would just be, how can that process be efficient and conducive to work? And finally, while there has been a lot of collaborations, as I look at, Egypt, and as I look at Sawiris Foundation and its collaborations with, the wider spectrum of players in the ecosystem in Egypt, I think that collaboration has been a lot less limited in the Arab world. So we were very happy to be part of, the C20 advisory committee. However, we were happy to, do certain MOUs with different organizations in the Arab world, but definitely the room for collaboration cross-country in the Arab world is definitely untapped. And I would hope that we would work together and learn from each other a lot more than we do today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noura. We're looking forward to exploring some more of these ideas. Before we go on to our next panelist, I wanted to put a poll question to our audience. So if everybody looks to the panel on the right-hand side of their screen, and you click on the poll tab, you can find the poll question. And our question today is, in your opinion, what should be the Arab region's priorities for funding over the coming decade? And we have a number of options, including health, education, economic development, human rights, social justice and democracy, climate, arts and culture, and other. And if you select other, it would be great to hear your insights shared in the chat. So I'll give people a few moments to answer this. And I know also our audience today is coming from all around the world, so it'll be interesting to have a global view looking at what everyone thinks the funding priorities in the Arab region should be. All right, so it looks like, sorry, there's a lot of options. Let me scroll down. It looks like the responses were sort of split between many of the answers, but the majority seem to feel that funding priorities should be focused on climate. So we can come back to that a bit later in our conversation. But next, I'd like to turn the floor over to MOUKTHAR. So MOUKTHAR, you have worn a few different hats in the world of philanthropy, including as a donor at Ford, in community philanthropy as a founder of the Rawa Fund, and now as a consultant and advisor in the sector. So I think it would be great to hear your thoughts on some of these same questions from your own point of view. What do you think about the trends and trajectory of philanthropy in the Arab region?
Thank you. Great to be here, and very heartwarming to see so many colleagues and mentors in the room. Before I start, I realize that Rawa is a new player within the Palestinian philanthropy landscape, and we're only here as an experimental project, and we'd like to acknowledge Ta'awun, our sister Ta'awun, and Dahlia Association and Qattan Foundation, who have been incredible philanthropies and foundations working in Palestine for many, many years. Let me start by just running some numbers that I looked at yesterday out of curiosity. I was looking at the World Wealth Index yesterday, and Singapore has about 0.38% of the world's wealth, whereas say the UAE is at 0.25%, Saudi Arabia is at 0.43%, and Egypt at 0.25%. No other Arab countries, come close beyond those numbers. And then I looked also at the ranking, the happiness index, which is an amalgamation of GDP and social support, health, freedom, generosity, minus corruption. And the vast majority of Arab countries really scored in the lower half of the spectrum. The happiest country was Finland, in case you were curious, and the least happy was South Sudan. The same goes for the World Press Freedom Index. Arab countries score dramatically low on those index. Surprise, surprise, in terms of wealth inequity, our region comes in absolutely last on the index, where 61% of the wealth in the region is held by 10% of the population. So I wanted us to just it's a little bit of a sobering picture, but I think it's really important to understand the environment that we are working in, and in order to be pragmatic about what needs to happen. So obviously, NAILA mentioned it, for a healthy ecology to prosper for civil society in general, you need a good balance between the public, the private, and the third sector. And so when we have in our region a kind of a public sector that is struggling, and a private sector that is emerging, and a third sector is kind of struggling, given also the recent waves of the shrinking of civic society and civic space in the region, it's a challenging picture, to say the least. Obviously, the regulatory landscape in terms of legal status, tax deductions, incentives, the possibility for many civil society groups to even register in our countries is still a major challenge. So democratic capital, if the word democracy scares people, participatory governance, collective decision making, issues of accountability are essential for the healthy development of a philanthropic landscape. And let's not forget taxes and what that implications are, or the lack of proper taxations in our countries to really support public life and civic life. So I don't want to be a pessimist. I'm incredibly excited by the development over the last decade of the institutional philanthropic landscape. I remember I was working at Ford when we were working on the first grant for the Arab Foundations Forum, and I served some time at the Gerhardt Center for Civic Engagement and Philanthropy, and those were early days of really setting the boundaries and the needs for the philanthropic sector. at this, broadly, I think philanthropic giving, institutional philanthropic giving in the region remains safe. It extends occasionally and increasingly within the realm of kind of soft development issues, but it really shies away from detrimental, urgent social and human rights issues. And as well, there's an over-reliance by foundations in the region to implement programs themselves rather than trust partners and build relationships and use grant making and other investment tools that are available for our sector. So with very little room to maneuver in a working environment with shrinking civic space, it's very difficult for philanthropists, of which there are increasing amount of people of them in our region, to also maneuver freely in their types of giving because of the kind of political alliances and the kind of the business alliances that they need to maneuver in the region. So at a time when philanthropy globally is questioning the issues of power and its kind of inherent patriarchy and sort of colonial dimensions, and trying to democratize access to resources, I worry that philanthropic institutions in the region are mimicking a kind of a Western paradigm of top-down decision-making, stringent requirements, and kind of perfunctory administrative processes for grantees. Now, moving forward, I'm obviously more resources for learning, which was already mentioned, but I would also say real training and mentoring for emerging philanthropists in the region is crucial. Obviously, pushing for enabling environments, as well as trying to have more transparency and democratic decision making within the philanthropies, our foundations themselves. I'm very excited, and in Rawa's model, in the whole area of participatory philanthropy and participatory grant making, because fundamentally it is embodies the values and the aspirations of collective decision-making, democratizing access to resources, and a shared horizontal approach to development that is more in tune with feminist values than sort of patriarchy and patronage, which have so plagued the philanthropic landscape for many years. So Rawa is a prototype, it's an experiment, and it's part of a global movement to try to demonstrate that by sharing power and building knowledge at the grassroots level, you not only build civic engagement and leadership, but also have better results in terms of outputs. And we can go back to that at a later stage. I can also provide some resources on participatory philanthropy in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, MOUKTHAR. Actually, before we go on, I would be interested to hear you speak a bit about models of philanthropy. Sorry, I think you have a bit of feedback around your mic. I don't know if you're moving something close to it, but just a note. Anyways, but it would be great to hear you speak about models of philanthropy in the Arab region, like what's working, what's not. The Arab region has an incredible culture of giving. Is that being harnessed by the institutional philanthropy that's sort of come into its own in the last decade or so? Is community philanthropy and participatory grant making, is that becoming more widespread? What do you think is happening here?
So I think what we've witnessed over the last, say, 10 to 15 years is re-granting funds support organizations. I hate the word intermediaries because it's a transactional term. It doesn't really describe organizations that are anchored at the community level and re-granting funds from development agencies, individual donors, and foundations. But we've got good examples of re-granting organizations that are providing support and small funds to community-based organizations. They're more successful, once again, in areas of youth development, arts and culture, a little bit in community development, but we've had bad unfortunately, experiences in supporting such organizations when it comes to human rights and social justice issues because of the thorny, tricky notion, difficulty for local philanthropists to donate to such causes. I see huge interest and possibility in community philanthropy. There are great examples over the last decade that have popped up in places like Egypt and Palestine, Dahlia Association, and I see that as an immediately easy first step for philanthropists in the region and for big foundations to really support community philanthropy and all forms of re-granting as an obvious step to democratize access to resources and to build local leadership and capacity on the ground.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. So I think we're going to head to a poll question next. Again, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see it under the poll tab. Our question is, what, in your opinion, is the main barrier for the further development of a philanthropic landscape in the region? Lack of legislative and fiscal infrastructure, an underdeveloped culture of giving, trust, limited democratic capital, underdeveloped civic and NGO landscape, and other. So again, you can only pick one, but if you do pick other, please go ahead and share your thoughts with us in the chat. So I'll give it a few minutes for everyone to answer. So it looks like, again, our answers are split across several of the options, but tied for majority is lack of legislative and fiscal infrastructure and an underdeveloped civic and NGO landscape. So next, I want to pass it to RASHA, who I know you've been experiencing a few technical difficulties. Can you hear us now?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, welcome back.
Okay. My cookies kicked me out, so.
So we've heard from MOUKTHAR and NOURA both speaking from their own point of view about the trajectory of philanthropy in the Arab region. And it would be great to hear your thoughts on this same question, especially from your vantage point in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, thank you, Alika. And I'm sorry I'm not able to comment on the previous speakers as I was dealing with all of this. But I think I would say the GCC generally and Saudi Arabia in particular, I think that there has been a great movement forward. I think that the governments and certain philanthropists, be they individuals or foundations, have really been working to elevate the NGOs and the efficacy and the governance that manage these NGOs. But I think that giving in general has been influenced by two main forces. And I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, repeating what has already been said, but I think that giving is still, as it is with many organizations or many philanthropists all over the world, it's very much based on relationships, right? The relationship that the philanthropist creates with either the organization or a group of people, or maybe a family foundation for internal giving and so forth. So, and this is the case obviously in Saudi Arabia as well. And in the Gulf. Another major force at play is the religious definition of what giving should be and what is worthy of giving. And so these two understandings and these two sort of either your relationship with others or your relationship with the Sharia and how it defines just giving, really, I think, dominates the field of philanthropy in the Middle East at this point, or in the GCC at this point, as it is mostly, predominantly a Muslim-based culture of giving. I think that, how can NGOs and philanthropists work to increase sort of the appreciation and trust in an organization that goes beyond the persona of its leadership, beyond the trustworthiness of its leadership. In the GCC, one way that has been followed is through the professionalization of the sector. So government and philanthropists have been working on increasing the legislation and the rulings and the sort of the ecosystem, developing the ecosystem in which NGOs work. So post 9/11, there was a big focus on governance and transparency to make sure that none of the giving is funneled into terrorist activities. I would say in the last decade, there's been a push by NGOs and philanthropists to really establish to be more efficient, to encourage the establishment of nonprofits as government partners in order to achieve socioeconomic equity. So understanding an organization's goals, its business methods, transparent and consistent reporting, impact-driven and evidence-based programming, these are all sort of comfort food to a philanthropist, or let's say a more corporate-styled philanthropist. I think that philanthropists, more traditional-based philanthropists, might focus even more so on the personality of those leading and running the organization. But I think within the GCC, another way to encourage trust and appreciation of NGOs is also to work with religious leaders to make sure that a wider definition of worthy causes for zakat or sadaqah and general giving be espoused and then disseminated. I think we have a huge potential to unlock within the zakat in order to support more wide-ranging organizations. I think we must go beyond the feeding and the housing and to think more about empowerment and education and so forth. And so I think that we have the fatwas. I think there just needs to be a larger dissemination of it and a larger discussion of it within the religious community to give comfort to those who for them, the Sharia is very important. And so I think that could unlock a huge source of philanthropy or philanthropic giving. With regards to my work or what we do in Saudi Arabia, in Alnahda society, which is a non-profit organization that's been around since 1962, all the time working on women's socioeconomic empowerment. I think for us, we've been really focused, especially in the last 5 years, as our country opens up more, as there's more interaction between men and women and so forth. And there's really now a push. We used to be called the Philanthropic Society for Women. We have since dropped the philanthropic and women and just kept Alnahda society because we really, in Arabic, it translates to khayriya, which can also be translated as charity. And so really for us, we really want to make sure that we are going beyond just the basic charitable, traditional fields and really thinking about empowerment and really also focusing on making sure that we are working together, men and women. Our slogan is that we empower women to elevate a nation. And so I think that it's only with working together, men and women, and convincing both men and women that they are both better off when both are better off, focusing on equity, focusing on socioeconomic justice, that is truly how a society can rise and can make sure to end poverty and injustice. And so we focus on that we rise together, nanhad sawa, which I think is really important, because when it cannot be just a woman's issue, it has to be a societal issue, and therefore we need to bring men in to be our partners. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rasha. Now we're going to open up our webinar to a Q&A. So just a reminder to everyone, you can put questions under the chat tab on the right-hand side of the screen. Many of you have been sending your questions to the admin only, which is perfectly fine. But if you want to participate in the conversation with everyone, make sure that right next to type your comment above that, there's a box and you can select send to everyone. So yes, for our first question, maybe we could actually go to one of the poll responses. So I'm going to put this one to NOURA. Maybe you can share your own thoughts on this. It seemed like among our audience today, the feeling was that a lack of legislative and fiscal infrastructure and an underdeveloped civic and NGO landscape were two barriers to the further development of a philanthropic landscape in the Arab region. And I was just wondering if you wanted to share any thoughts on this or any perceived barriers that you think maybe we didn't speak about in the poll.
Thank you, Elka. I think I noticed that trust was also high on the poll. I'm not sure how much it got, but I think that's a more complicated one because it's a sort of trust has many, many layers. So I'll stick first perhaps to the lack of legislative and fiscal infrastructure. And to me, that was not surprising. And I think that, you know, the space, one, every country has its different regulations, right? So when you talk, I think it's very difficult to talk Arab world when it comes to legislative and fiscal infrastructure. And every country tends to have, you know, its governing entity, normally a Ministry of Social Solidarity, you know, replace that name with each country's own sort of name. But basically, I think one, the laws tend to not be so straightforward. So I'll reflect at least on the Egypt case. I think that understanding the NGO law itself is not that easy. Right? And a lot of NGOs actually don't have that much funding for even legal support. So for example, in Egypt now, we had a new law come out and then the executive bylaws come out. And there have been a number of organizations like the AUC Gerhardt Center supporting in setting up those webinars to provide access for NGOs to understand what that means for them. Right? And so I think that, you know, having the proper infrastructure, but understanding the infrastructure, understanding how to operate, I think large organizations know that, understand how to do that, can pay, you know, the legal fees associated with having someone advise them on how to do that. If I think of Sawiris Foundation, you know, and the legal advice that we need and we get to do that as a donor, I think this is significant. And that is not available for, you know, the 55,000 NGOs that are present. And so I think that there's the infrastructure, but there is also how can, to me, a main question is how can larger, you know, organizations, NGOs support others in, you know, understanding the legal infrastructure and in understanding the avenues by which they can operate within the existing laws, I think is a key point. It's something that we're thinking actively about. What is our role as a foundation to our partner NGOs in ensuring that they get access to that kind of services, or what kind of discussions can we help collaborate? Definitely, I think the fiscal part is the part that, you know, people talk about a lot because funding flows require, you know, complicated approval processes across the Arab world. it tends to be, much more straightforward elsewhere. And I think even if I reflect, not just as Sawiris Foundation, but when I reflect at Arab Foundations Forum, which existed to be a pan-Arab network, this is where we saw this complication arise. Because I think countries, understand very well their own, I can operate within what is required for me in Egypt, and I can talk to the ministry and understand what they need from me as an Egyptian organization. But having the kind of discussion where, I exist in X country, but I actually serve all the Arab world, I think is something that is not common and is very underdeveloped. And therefore, what legal infrastructure, okay, there's the legal infrastructure of the country that you reside in, but then there are all those members that you serve across the Arab world. So I think this was one case that brought this out. And for me, dialogue is key. Lobbying is key, but you need to, and I think there were a number of, colleagues that mentioned that, knowing how to have that dialogue, developing the relationships with government, not having those dialogues in isolation. So I attend a lot of things where it's NGOs talking to NGOs about the lack of legislative and fiscal, it's really futile, and it will not get this going anywhere. And I think having some understanding of the concerns that governments have that then lead to why these laws need to exist, and then trying to address these concerns as NGOs and continuing that conversation. In Egypt, it has been useful in actually changing the law, a law that was previously passed just 2 years ago prior to this one. And so I think it needs to be continuous dialogue, continuous lobbying, but really an open conversation with governments where you relay your point, but you are open to understanding what are the things that they need to exist as well that alleviate certain concerns that I think exist for us in the Arab world. And probably some of them are definitely, at least some of them are definitely valid. For me, I'll just comment on trust quickly. I think trust is, for me, rings very true when we talk about transparency. It's very difficult for me to trust if I don't know. And so I think that I see if we as a sector are moving towards more transparency, if there's data made more available by governments as well, by research organizations, etc., then this helps build trust. Because I think that perception is reality at the end of the day, and I think a lot of people still perceive the NGO sector to be opaque, to be a bit of a black box. You ask an organization about, how much funds they raised this year, and they look at you like you just asked about their personal salary. And to me, that's very strange that this is a question that is met with, what did you just ask me? And I think that would definitely help address the trust issue. And finally, just very quickly on the NGO landscape, because I think for me, this is one that we struggle with at Sawiris Foundation as a donor. Right? Because at the end of the day, you look for implementing partners that come from NGOs. And there, I think that as a sector globally, not just in the Arab world, but definitely in the Arab world, it was not the attractive sector where people look to go, right? So at least in Egypt, it's the place where you sort of go, prior to dying, right? You go and you want to do good, so you go and you lead an organization, an NGO, or you volunteer there. So how can the NGO landscape become an attractive sector for young talent, or talented individuals? And there, I think, again, has to do with being professional, having trust, so being transparent, paying people properly. And I think it's not something that we talk about enough, but you need to pay for talent. And if you want talent to be in the NGO sector, then you need to be open to also paying for talent. And it's basically the chicken or the egg, right? Like lower quality programming because you have low calibers, you have high turnovers. And so this is something that I think we are continuously asking ourselves as an organization, how can we support that? And then how can we support by supporting organizations build their infrastructure? So a lot of funding tends to be very restricted to programming. We're guilty of that too. But then how do you expect there to be a strong, NGO sector with organizations that have strong sustainable infrastructure?
Thank you, Noura. That was very interesting. I want to put our next question to RASHA. This one comes from Ata Kutub in our chat, who asks, how much success have you seen moving zakat and sadaqah funds to support empowerment? And what do you think needs to be done to achieve more of that?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think this goes to what I have been talking about earlier, and that is that there are fatwas out there. We have them, they exist, but they're not circulated. And so we at Alnahda have fatwas that support, and fatwas from long ago. I mean, they have been by the meaning that they're not sort of modern day fatwas, but rather they are by the leading legal scholars that have been around and have great respect overall. And they encourage us to use zakat for education, for empowering, for training for employment, and so forth, because we all understand that that's the only way that these families are going to break the cycle of poverty and are going to be able to empower themselves and their families. And so obviously, when we are in times of famine, or when we are in times in which the main requirement is food and shelter, then obviously, those are the basic needs, and we must start with that. But once those have been fulfilled, then we do have the space, we do have the room to look elsewhere and to find out what are the unmet needs of impoverished families in order to help support them exiting that reliance on nonprofits and on charity for their existence. So, I mean, to answer the question, there has been success, but we would like to see it more widely discussed, and we would like to see more people being able to apply that, as there is still a strong belief among many philanthropists and donors that there is this idea from the hand to the hand, and so that leads to lack of transparency and a lot of trust in that one hand that's giving to others. So,
thank you, Rasha. Our next question I'm going to put to MOUKTHAR. It comes from Chris Carney from Barcelona, who asks, you talked earlier about developing philanthropic models that did not follow the Anglo-US model. Could you comment on how that might look?
I think that it's not a question of just questioning. It's more about questioning existing paradigms and existing structures that we've throughout our world. They tend to be Western. They tend to be with colonial dimensions. They tend to be patriarchal. But I think what we're seeing all around the world, whether it's at the grassroots activism level, whether it's within philanthropy, whether it's in areas of democratic participation, is more hybrid, collective forms of decision making, more horizontal structures. Where we don't rely on a fearless leader who usually tends to be a man to make decisions, where we make decisions more collectively in groups, in forums, with communities, where the distinction between the giver and the recipient is not so flagrant, where we develop forms of mutual aid rather than reliance, where we hope to achieve communities that are active in the decision making and owning the solutions to their problems rather than passive recipients of aid and resources. And so, it is an entire unlearning of how we question how we structure ourselves in terms of decision making. And I strongly believe that if we have a decolonizing lens in our approach to problem solving, and if we have a lens, a feminist lens to solving problems moving forward, it helps us guide. It guides us to looking at where power resides and who essentially is making decisions. And ultimately, the more that people make decisions collectively, and that there's a diversity of voices and perspectives represented in any system of governance, the better it's going to be, because it's going to be more resilient, it's going to be more authentic, it's going to have more creativity, it's going to achieve better results. It's not going to be just follow perfunctory processes and sort of end game results, the way so much of our philanthropic giving globally and development aid has reached. We've reaching really a threshold, I think, and a moment of reckoning in global philanthropy in general, that requires us to rethink how, who holds the wealth, how, who's making decisions about the wealth, and also in terms of how we open up the decision-making processes, because essentially democratizing access to resources is about wealth, dealing with wealth inequity, and the current kind of model, the predominant model of philanthropies that we have adopted, and also sadly adopted in the South, tend to be kind of a patron-like model where wealth is reserved and is accumulated, rather than put to within the reach of communities who really have a better sense of how to dispense them.
So, Elika, can I just jump in and ask a follow-up question? Because I think somebody asked on the chat here about how innovative civil society interventions can thrive, because usually they require a free and open society. And so I think, following up to the discussion with MOUKTHAR about localizing philanthropy, and kind of respecting that the local expertise, et cetera, and I think I'd be interested to hear, actually, from the three panelists, how is this possible in the Arab region in the absence of such a space? Because we have to be honest with ourselves. Like, that space does not exist, definitely not on a regional scale, and as much as we know, not individually in an individual country scale. So what is innovative civil society to do to be innovative in such a restricted space? I would be interested to hear what the panelists have to say about that. So maybe we can ask Rasha first, and then take it from there.
I think every country has its own restrictions. I think some have more than others, but I think that using those restrictions as sort of throwing up our hands and saying we can't do anything is not productive. I think we need to always find our way to work within the system, find our way within to make the greatest impact, and always, be transparent in what we're doing. But I think you can always find a way, regardless of the restrictions. You can be innovative, even if within the most restrictive guidelines, there's always a way to be innovative. I know of a particular school here, a nonprofit school, when we were under extreme restrictions as to exactly what must be taught, exactly what must be shared with students. And they were able to use the materials given to create discussion and to create a more open way of thinking. So I don't think that we should be restricted by, yes, there are restrictions, but I think there's always a way, and there's always a way to be innovative, and you become innovative in the way that you deal with the restrictions.
Noura, would you like to, MOUKTHAR, either of you, would you like to comment on NAILA's question? Let's say Noura.
Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. Thank you, and sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I was very enthusiastic about what Rasha was saying, and I largely agree with it, because I think that, you know, to operate well and effectively in the philanthropic sector in the Arab world, you have to have optimism and perseverance and resilience. And the only other point that I would add to what Rasha said is the point on building trust. And so I think if you want to innovate, you need to invest the time to build trust within the system, to build trust with government players. And I think that once you have established trust, you tend to have more room for innovation, because people trust you. They understand that what you're trying to do, even when you're experimenting with something new, is because they fundamentally understand that you are driven by a mission and a vision that is to serve your country and, you know, the people that need it within your country. So it is difficult, but I think it can be done if you take the time. If you look at it as a long term, you know, if you look sort of like, you know, right at your feet and you're trying to get something done, it won't happen. But if you have spent the time to establish the right relationships, I think there is room. I can't hear you, but I'm gonna see what's wrong on my side.
All right, can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. MOUKTHAR, I just want to pass this question to you. Thank you for everyone for bearing with our technical difficulties today. I think if MOUKTHAR, you can take the question and then we'll wrap up for our hour.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. You know, I think that given our limited capacity to impact the broader kind of democratic landscape in our parts of the world, I think what we can certainly do is have an impact at a local level. And so I am a strong believer in local philanthropy, community philanthropy, localized giving, but also we need to think about alternative structures where a bit more freedom and experimentation is possible. You know, so far, philanthropy has been kind of separated in its own silo from other financial practices, and I think that, you know, in this coming period, it's going to be imperative for us to look at social investment, social enterprises, rethink notions of cooperatives, and look at financial technology tools that can help crowdsource, but also create pockets of wealth and spaces of experimentation in our parts of the world. I mean, I think, you know, what my main message would be, you know, my closing remark would be is, you know, in a landscape where decision making is so limited, where generations and generations of people have been stripped away from the very basic notion of decision making when it comes to their personal lives, to their social lives, to their collective life, I think creating spaces where people can begin to exercise some form of decision making and collective decision making, learning kind of a civic space, embodying a civic space at a micro level is really the best thing that we can do in this sector moving forward in this coming period, until we have more access to democratic and civic spaces.
Thank you so much, MOUKTHAR. So that wraps up our hour together today. And thank you everyone for bearing with our audio and technical difficulties this afternoon. We will be producing a recording of this event, which everyone who has attended today will get a copy of. I just wanted to say, if you found today's discussion helpful and engaging, don't forget to go to the offer section on the right of your screen, and you can get a free print copy of our latest issue with any donation over £5. If anyone is interested in subscribing to Alliance, we'll be sending out emails to you shortly with a discount code on how to get started. And I wanted to say a huge thank you to our expert panelists today, RASHA, MOUKTHAR, and NOURA. Thank you to our partner, Arab Foundations Forum, and to NAILA for joining us today to share her insights. Thank you to our sponsor, the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. Thank you to the Alliance team, and in particular, our marketing, advertising, and events manager, Amy McGoldrick, who produced today's event. And thank you to all of you for being part of the Alliance community today. Our next webinar is next Thursday, February 25th at 2 p.m. GMT, with a panel discussing Scale Up. And our Future of Philanthropy series continues in April, when we take a look at what the next decades may hold for Latin American philanthropy. And finally, keep an eye out for the next issue of Alliance, which explores the intersection of law and philanthropy. It's guest edited by colleagues at the Ford and Baring Foundations, and it comes out on March 2nd. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and see you next time.